Hook, A Riddle in the Gears, narrated by Dr. John H. Watson. The fog had sunk low over Baker Street, thick and unshifting, like a smothering woolen blanket drawn tight across the city. Lamps barely cut through it. The light from our own bay window barely reached the edge of the sill. All London seemed to be holding its breath. I had long grown accustomed to such mornings in Holmes's company, mornings when neither case nor client presented themselves, and my companion lapsed into one of his peculiar states of introspective discontent. Chapter 1. Sherlock Holmes reclined on the settee in his dressing gown, threadbare, ancient, and only marginally cleaner than the Persian slipper in which he kept his tobacco. He had not eaten, had not touched his violin, and had only spoken once to dismiss the morning edition of the Times with a scornful flick of the wrist and a curt remark about editorial incompetence of a near-criminal degree. He was bored, and, for Holmes, boredom was perilously close to madness. I had just settled into my chair with a copy of The Lancet, hoping to distract myself from the subtle storm gathering across the room, when a sharp rapping came at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered. Moments later, her face drawn in a curious frown. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes," she said. "He insists it's urgent, though I can't say he looks the part." "Send him in," Holmes said, without lifting his eyes from the ceiling. The visitor stepped in, his form half devoured by the fog that clung to the threshold like a ghost unwilling to let go. He was a small man, spare in frame, bundled in a thick scarf and worn overcoat with elbow patches blackened by years of use. His spectacles fogged instantly, and he removed them with nervous fingers to reveal eyes that glimmered with urgency and exhaustion. "Mr. Holmes?" he asked in a voice precise and mechanical, as though each syllable were the click of a gear. Holmes did not move. "That depends," he said lazily, "on whether you've brought me something trivial or something impossible. I only attend to the latter." The man blinked, as though unsure whether to be offended. I believe it is the latter. My name is Josiah Rendell. I own Rendell and Sons Clockworks on Fleet Lane. My family has been clockmakers for nearly 80 years. Holmes stirred, as if some internal lever had been thrown. "Noble profession," he said. "One that requires meticulous attention and a deeply mathematical mind. What brings a horologist to my doorstep?" Without speaking, Rendell drew a battered leather satchel from under his coat. His hands trembled slightly as he unclasped it, and removed a pocket watch larger than most, curiously baroque in design, gleamed dully in the lamplight, as though it had been polished, not with cloth, but by handling too frequently, too fearfully. The object was grotesquely ornate, where most pocket watches boasted elegance. This one demanded attention. A small serpent golden coiled wrapped itself around a winding crown, its head forming the hinge, its tail subtly doubling as the hour hand, tongue stretched as the minute. "May I?" Holmes asked softly, already rising to take the watch from the man's trembling hand. "Okay." Rendell nodded, visibly relieved. "Cato." Holmes held it delicately, turning it over, lifting it to his ear. He sniffed it, tapped it. Then he depressed the catch at the back and flipped the casing open. A strange tune played 3 slow, dissonant notes like the tolling of a mournful bell. Then silence. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Think the melody, engraved in sharp, tiny lettering, were words that sent a chill crawling up my spine. "At the 12th hour, the truth shall break. Until then, your breath I take." Holmes read it aloud, then glanced at our visitor. "You have my attention." Rendell's voice cracked as he spoke. "That watch appeared on my workbench 4 days ago. No customer left it. None of my apprentices claimed it. It was simply K. It was wound, ticking, and playing that tune. I assumed it had been misplaced. I set it aside." He paused, eyes growing glassy. That very day, my eldest son, Arthur, collapsed in our workshop. No warning, no illness. It's dead before the ambulance arrived. Its doctors said his heart simply stopped. Holmes did not flinch, but I noticed the way his fingers stiffened slightly against the casing. 3 nights later, Rendell continued. My second son, Samuel, was found unconscious face down beside the long case clock in our main showroom. No signs of trauma. He remains in a coma at St. Bartholomew's. Doctors say he may never wake. And your third son? Holmes asked, almost idly. Gone, Rendell said. Fled to Manchester yesterday morning. He's 23 and terrified he's next. Holmes turned the watch over once more, then held it to his ear. Curious, he murmured. It ticks you, Spud, not as a watch should. It is staggered, labored, as if it marks not the passage of time, but the approach of something inevitable. Rendell looked stricken. Mr. Holmes, I do not frighten easily, but I know timepieces. I know their voice. And this one lies. Holmes gave a small, approving nod. You tried to dismantle it. Rendell hesitated. The back screws are decorative. Inside, the cogs are wrong, hollow, strange, and the escapement clicks even when I remove the balance wheel. It behaves like no mechanism I've ever touched. It was not meant to be understood by a clockmaker, Holmes murmured. It was meant to unnerve one. I shifted in my seat. Are you suggesting, Holmes, that this was designed to appear cursed? Holmes looked at me with a faint smile. Precisely. The object is no more magical than your medical bag, Watson, but it has been engineered with psychological precision to evoke dread, misdirection, and delay. Rendell was pale. So you believe someone is what? Murdering my sons? With a watch? I believe someone wants you to believe. Dad, Holmes said. And the only certainty is that they want you terrified, disoriented, and doubting your own trade. Will you come to my shop? Rendell asked quietly. Immediately. But I will arrive later, and under a different guise, Holmes replied. You will return alone. Act as if you have been dismissed. I intend to observe your premises without revealing myself. Leave the watch with me. Rendell nodded, setting the watch gently on the side table, as though even its stillness might bite. Please, Mr. Holmes. My family is all I have. Ata. He left. Silence returned to our rooms, but it was a different kind now. It pressed in, heavy and expectant. Holmes did not sit. He stared at the watch as though waiting for it to betray itself. Then he said softly, Do you see it, Watson? It's the elegance of the illusion. Cursed watch delivered into the hands of a man whose entire identity rests upon the precision of time. Then, one by one, his sons fall not by blade or poison, but by mystery. He lifted the watch to his ear, listening again to its dark, uneven rhythm. Someone is winding down the Rendell family, Watson. And they're doing it by design, not by curse. It's a consultation, Shadows of Fleet Lane, narrated by Dr. John H. Watson. The next morning, I found Holmes gone. It was not unusual for him to vanish before dawn on the scent of a lead. But there was something about the empty breakfast table and the untouched coals in the grate that unsettled me. The cursed watch still sat where he left it, coiled like a sleeping serpent, atop a leather blotter, its muted ticking sounding almost amused. I pocketed it on impulse, not trusting his presence in the open, and stepped out into the drab drizzle of a London morning. The fog, as ever, clung low to the cobbles. Fleet Lane was a short walk, but a world away from Baker Street, a narrower, more mechanical world, where every shop window glittered with the cold gleam of brass, copper, and iron. Rendell and Sons Clockworks stood between a cobbler shop and a tobacconist. Its facade, dark with soot and age, its window, filled with pendulums and coiled springs frozen in mid-movement. The front glass was painted in flaking gold leaf, proclaiming established 1817 horologists to the gentry. A modest bell tinkled as I entered. The air was heavy, with oil, dust, and silence. Josiah Rendell stood behind the counter, his head bowed over a half-disassembled carriage clock. He looked up as I approached, recognition flashing in his weary eyes. "Dr. Watson," he said. "You came." I did. Holmes asked me to make a preliminary observation. "He'll arrive later, in disguise." Rendell nodded, unsurprised. "Of course. He prefers shadows, doesn't he?" "Only when something has hidden in them," I replied. He gestured for me to follow him through the curtain behind the counter, into a narrow workshop crowded with benches, tools, and parts arranged with a craftsman's neatness. Along one wall stood a tall mahogany cabinet containing nearly a dozen pocket watches, each tagged and meticulously catalogued. But what drew my attention was the space where one clearly should have been an empty, velvet-lined niche, marked only with a yellowing label that read, "Unclaimed Serpent Watch. Received the 11th of June. 11th of June." "None of my apprentices recall seeing who left it," Rendell said quietly. "It wasn't there the night before. I found it the morning Arthur died." He ran a hand through his graying hair. "It's more than coincidence. I've worked this bench since I was a boy. No one gets past that counter without being seen." I looked around. The room was immaculate but sterile, somehow lovingly maintained, yet joyless, as though something vital had been drained from it. "How long has your family worked here?" I asked. "Since the Regency," Rendell said. "My great-grandfather opened this shop. My sons were to carry it on. Arthur was the craftsman. Samuel handled clients and finances. Edward was still learning. Now," his voice caught. I saw the tension ripple through his knuckles as he gripped the workbench. "Tell me about the night Samuel collapsed," I said. I'd just gone upstairs. It was late past 11. He stayed to wind the grandfather clocks. He liked doing it alone. Said it gave him peace. He gestured toward a tall case clock standing at the back of the showroom, half hidden in the shadows. I heard a sound to chime I didn't recognize, not from any of ours. Then a crash. When I rushed down, he was on the floor, just beside that clock. His hand was outstretched, as if he were reaching for something, or warding it off. And the watch was ticking at the time. Rendell hesitated. "Yes, always ticking. Even now, when I've tried to dismantle it." I removed the object from my coat pocket and set it gently on the bench. Rendell flinched, then gathered himself. "Would you care to show me what you found when you attempted to take it apart?" He retrieved a velvet cloth and unfolded it carefully, revealing a jeweler's screwdriver, a loop, and 2 bent pins. Began to work with practiced hands. Despite his trembling, his movements were exact, steady, and slow. The kind of precision one learns only through decades of repetition. But after 3 minutes, his expression shifted from professional scrutiny to bafflement. "Look here," he said, pointing. "This screw appears to be made of brass, but the threads are fused to the housing like they were cast whole. I can't extract them, and the gears." He opened the faceplate with some effort, and we both leaned closer. The gears were not true gears at all. They were flattened rings with a regular teeth knot, designed to mesh or turn, but merely to suggest movement. Some bore tiny inscriptions, others appeared decorative, but served no mechanical purpose. One bore the engraving of an hourglass, another of a scythe. The most central gear, where the escapement should sit, contained a tiny mirror, no larger than a thimble's base, polished and deeply reflective. "It's a mockery," Rendell said, "a mechanical illusion." Just then, a gust of wind stirred the shop door, setting the tall clocks to groaning and chiming in discordant unison. The entire showroom briefly echoed with their metallic cries of sound, both beautiful and mournful. It was followed by another sound, the voice of Sherlock Holmes. Quite the performance, wouldn't you say? We turned to see a portly gentleman with a white mustache and bowler hat standing in the doorway. He tipped the hat, removed his false mustache, and handed it to a stunned Rendell. "My apologies," Holmes said, "for the deception. I needed to observe the shop in its natural state. And you, Mr. Rendell, passed the test. You didn't try to hide the object or embellish your account. It speaks in your favor." He stepped forward, eyes already scanning the shelves, walls, corners. "Coon, I timed my arrival to match the hour." Samuel collapsed 11:43 precisely. And wouldn't you know it, just as I turned the corner, the street lamps flickered. 3 times. Electrical anomalies along Fleet Lane, evidently a recent development. "Surely that's irrelevant," I said. "Is it?" Holmes replied. "Imagine you were trying to manipulate a series of rooms or clocks or hearts. A sudden pulse of electromagnetic interference could do peculiar things to both timepieces and physiology. But my sons are not machines, Mr. Holmes," Rendell said with pain in his voice. "No," Holmes said gently. "But whoever orchestrated this wants you to think they were broken. The illusion of inevitability, death that ticks toward Umina by minute. This is no curse, Mr. Rendell. This is theater." He turned to me. "Watson, take this down. I need addresses for the supplier of Mr. Rendell's brass components, the most recent customer orders, and anyone who accessed the workshop between the 10th and the 13th of June. He paused, sniffing the air. "And find out who in this neighborhood recently had dealings with an artisan called Finley Quaid," I asked. "It's an eccentric metal worker, obscure designs, religious relics, and mechanical curios. Once built a timepiece for a Venetian cult that chimed only during eclipses. This watch bears his fingerprints, metaphorically, if not literally." Holmes turned to Rendell with sudden gravity. "Lock this watch away. Don't touch it again. And do not allow your remaining son to return under any circumstances." "But Edward's all I have." "All the more reason," Holmes said darkly, "not to let him become the final movement in someone else's symphony." Chapter 2, Early Investigation into the Gears of Madness, narrated by Dr. John H. Watson. We parted ways at Fleet Lane shortly after Holmes's startling mention of the name Finley Quaid, name which, to me, held no significance, but which Holmes treated with the gravity of an omen. He left in haste, hailing a hansom without further explanation, his long form disappearing into the mist. I remained behind at Rendell's request, tasked with gathering information from local tradesmen and neighbors who might have observed anything or anyone unusual around the clock shop during the fateful days in question. As I took my leave, Rendell pressed a final concern upon me. "If Mr. Holmes is correct, Doctor," he said, voice low and brittle, "then whoever orchestrated this may still be watching us. And if that's so, they won't be finished." He glanced at the empty watch niche again. "Not until the hour strikes 12. I nodded grimly and stepped back into the fog. My first stop was a cobbler 2 doors down, a bearded man named Toller, who had worked Fleet Lane for nearly 20 years. He remembered the week clearly, mostly because of the unusual power fluctuations Holmes had already noted. "Gas lights dimmed twice that week," Toller said. "Not just here, across the block. You'd think we were under siege. And there was a chap strange fellow came through on the 11th, I think. Late afternoon." He scratched his chin. "Tall, heavy coat, despite the heat. Looked like he'd crawled out of a chimney face, all smudged. He didn't come in, just stood across from Rendell's for a good 5 minutes, staring at the shop window. Gave me the shivers." I thanked him and continued on. A few shops down, I spoke to a lamp fitter who repaired the gas fixtures outside Rendell and Sons, just days before the first incident. He, too, remembered the strange visitor. Didn't speak. Had a satchel. He touched the window, left a mark. greasy, like oil and ash. I wiped it off myself. It's 3 independent accounts, all pointing to the presence of a man who did not belong. Meanwhile, Holmes's end of the investigation took him deep into Spitalfields, to a converted stable, now listed without signages, the studio of Finlay Quaid. I learned of the visit later that evening, when Holmes returned to Baker Street, soaked through and more animated than I had seen him in weeks. "Watson," he said, flinging his coat across the back of a chair, "you've ever watched a man build madness with a jeweler's loop?" "You've seen Quaid?" "I have," Holmes replied, tugging off his gloves. "And if I hadn't, I would scarcely believe such a mind exists outside the confines of Bedlam." He sat down, fingers steepled beneath his chin. "His studio is a museum of contradictions. Bones alongside brass, scriptures etched into cogs, a wind-up crucifix that bleeds ink from the hands when the hour strikes, and at the center Quaid himself, filthy, precise, utterly lucid, and quite possibly the most dangerous artisan in London." "Did he admit to building the watch?" "Not in so many words," Holmes said, "but he recognized it. I showed him the sketch I had made." His eyes flared with pride. Holmes leaned forward. He called it a memento machina memory engine, designed not to keep time, but to count guilt. His words, not mine, spoke of it as if it were alive. I frowned. "And yet you let him remain free?" "For now," Holmes said. "He is a craftsman, Watson. A twisted one, but not the instigator. He does not deliver his creations. He simply builds for a commission. So someone came to him with a blueprint and a purpose. That's who we need." He stood and walked to the fireplace, retrieving the watch from its drawer. "The key is in the symbolism. The serpent, the inscriptions, the timepiece that ticks out dread instead of time. Quaid doesn't just craft devices, he engineers narratives. Whoever commissioned this is trying to make Mr. Rendell question his reality, his vocation, his very legacy." He turned the watch gently in his palm. "It's the artistry of cruelty." The following morning, I returned to St. Bartholomew's Hospital to visit Samuel Rendell, the second son, still unconscious. The staff had little hope. He lay beneath thin sheets, pale and unmoving, as though his soul was suspended in the ether, waiting for permission to return. Yet something else caught my attention. While checking his records, a nurse mentioned an oddity. "Mr. Rendell arrived with a peculiar smell on his skin," she said. "Not decay or blood, something chemical, like polishing oil mixed with incense. I've never encountered it before." I leaned closer and caught the faintest trace, subtle but unmistakable. I had smelled it once before, in the folds of the watch when I first handled it. When I reached Baker Street, Holmes was pacing, his eyes brilliant yet unfocused. "I've mapped the incidents," he said without preamble. "Arthur died on the 11th of June at precisely 11:58 p.m. Samuel collapsed on 14, 3 days late, exactly 11:43 p.m. A pattern. What of the 3rd CNED ward?" "A T fled before the next interval," Holmes replied. "A T, if the attacker is following a deliberate cadence, perhaps mimicking the watch's countdown we face strikes, timed to the minute. Something ritualistic." He paused. "And the link between the victims is not location or behavior, but their role in the family. Eldest, middle, youngest. A sequence, an inheritance," I ventured. "Or a punishment," Holmes murmured. "One tied to legacy. Why a clockmaker's family? Why a death that masquerades as mechanical failure?" He turned to the window, gazing over the fog-laden street. "Someone views vengeance as a mechanism wishing Josiah Rendell to watch his life unravel with the very tools that once measured his success." He faced me. "I need one final piece before I act. Go to the British Library, request every public contract, property deed, and legal dispute involving Rendell and Sons from the past decade. My suspicion begins not with the sons, but with the father. You think he is the true target? I asked. I think, Holmes said. Someone believes he wound the clock that led to ruin. Now they are returning the favor. The first theory, an inheritance of silence, narrated by Dr. John H. Watson late. That afternoon, I returned from the British Library to find Holmes hunched over the desk, his hands ink-stained, his cuffs gray with fireplace ash. He had cleared the mantelpiece and arranged items upon it as though preparing a sacrificial altar. 3 candles at uneven intervals, length of copper wire, and a small mirror angled to reflect firelight onto the watch. I had learned not to question these rituals too early. They were the visible gears of Holmes's mind out, yet illuminating. He glanced at me briefly. You were gone longer than expected. The clerk was slow but thorough, I said, removing my coat. I've brought deeds, contracts, tax filings. Rendell & Sons has faced little conflict, save one peculiar case on inheritance dispute. From 1873. Holmes raised a brow. Continue. Josiah Rendell's father, also a horologist, died under ambiguous circumstances. He fell from attic stairs while servicing a ceiling pulley. The will left the entire business to Josiah, bypassing his elder brother, Francis Rendell. Ah, Holmes said, standing upright. Interesting, indeed. He scanned the papers with relentless speed. Francis Rendell, disinherited, no criminal charges, reportedly left London soon after the funeral, then vanished. He tapped the page. Consider, Watson. Perhaps this mystery began not with Josiah's sons, but with Josiah's brother. Our revenge, delayed by decades. Revenge, Holmes mused, is a timepiece of its own. Some are wound swiftly. Others, once, then left to tick in darkness until the hour strikes. He stared into the mirror's reflected flame. Imagine Francis, humiliated and cast out, vanishing into obscurity, yet nursing injustice, lacking strength for direct retaliation. He could have raised a son or Whodunit, tales of betrayal, until, at last, they returned with something subtler than a knife, a performance. So this is staged punishment for Josiah's gain over Francis. Exactly. Whoever left that watch seeks not only death, they want Josiah to feel judged, to watch his legacy collapse one son at a time. Every element, the serpent encircling the hour, the cryptic inscription, the deliberate slowing of the watch evokes guilt, regret, fear. The craftsmanship is theatrical, psychological. I recalled the quiet devastation in Rendell's eyes, sorrow mingled with bewilderment, as though punished for an unnamed sin. Do you believe Josiah wronged his brother? I believe someone believes he did, Holmes replied. But that belief is enough to drive this machine. He thumbed the documents. Curious, the Rendell property line expanded in 1875. Francis contested it and lost. Could he still be alive? If so, said Holmes, he is nearly 80. Whether he lives is irrelevant. The idea of him lives on, and someone has taken up his cause. He fixed me with a keen stare. We must find Francis Rendell or his bloodline. Son, a nephew, anyone who inherited not property but resentment. A lineage unearthed. The next morning we visited the East London Archives, a cramped building, wedged between 2 railway bridges and perpetually rattled by trains. After much grumbling, a clerk retrieved a narrow ledger. Francis Rendell, born 1831, died 1898, buried in Poplar, survived by a single son, Elias Rendell. Holmes's eyes flashed. Elias' son forgettable. Any further records? Employment for E. Rendell, once, in 1903. Metal engraver. Nothing else. Holmes closed the ledger. Thank you, you've been less useless than most. Outside, he turned to me, energized. We now have motive, method, and lineage. Elias Rendell, trained in metalwork, raised on tales of dispossession. Recluse, builder of symbols, executioner. You think Elias commissioned the watch? I am certain. Who better to taint the legacy of a man who stole the family's ticking heart? We hailed a cab. Holmes instructed the driver to Poplar Cemetery. What do we hope to find? I asked. A ghost, Holmes replied, or its shadow. The cemetery was crooked with age. Moss cloaked many stones, and brambles devoured the paths. We located Francis Rendell's tilted headstone. 'Neath his name read. He kept perfect time, but it was not his own. At the base lay a faint engraving of a coiled serpent. So the mark predates the watch? I asked. Or the watch predates the crime, Holmes answered. This vengeance was rehearsed, designed, passed down like a blueprint. That evening, back at Baker Street, Holmes arranged silent police surveillance on the Rendell shop and alerted a reporter known to attract eccentrics. If Elias Rendell is watching, Holmes said, he will be drawn to the spectacle he created. If we bait the trap correctly, he will come to admire his work. You're using the deaths of Rendell's sons as bait. I'm using Elias's ego, his need to see justice served on his terms. But we must hurry if the pattern holds. The next strike comes tonight. My stomach turned. We must warn Josiah. We already have, Holmes said. Yet, I feared the true trap is not set for Edward at all. He turned the serpent watch once more. Together, we listened to its slow, deliberate ticking. Each beat carrying us closer to midnight. Chapter 3. A buried clue, whispers, and the mechanism narrated by Dr. John H. Watson. I have often described Sherlock Holmes as cold, clinical, surgically focused. Yet, there are moments rare, fleeting when his detachment yields to something else, a heightened intensity, a sharpening of every sense, as though he has passed through a veil unseen by others. I witnessed it that evening. It was nearly past 10. Fog had returned, coiling along Baker Street in heavy ribbons, and the city had settled into the ghostly hush that precedes a break in the night. I sat at my writing desk near the hearth, pretending to read, but unable to stop glancing at the serpent watch, where it lay still ticking, each click a faint pulse in the room's silence. Holmes stood motionless beside the window, his lean form outlined by the orange glow of gaslight diffused through mist. He had not spoken for nearly an hour, not since he had ordered the watch placed back on the table and extinguished every other light in the room except the fire. Was waiting for something, though I could not guess what. Then he moved, suddenly, decisively. "Tea," he said, without turning. "Bring me the lens and the spirit lamp." I obeyed, heart quickening. Holmes had that tone again, the one that meant he had seen something the rest of us had missed. He cleared a patch of the table, set the serpent watch in the center, and held the magnifying lens over its face. Then he lit the lamp and held the flame low, warming the gold casing slowly. "Holmes," I asked cautiously, "what do you expect?" "To find a ghost," he murmured, "or a whisper. Sometimes they are the same." Adjusted the heat until the metal began to dull. A sheen of condensation formed around the hinge, and then very faintly a line of letters emerged along the curve of the inner lid, invisible under ordinary light. Holmes inhaled sharply. "Hold the lens steady," he said. I obeyed, squinting. The letters were scorched rather than etched deliberate, but crude compared to the precise engravings on the rest of the device. It was as if someone had branded them hastily into the surface. "The hour belongs to the liar. The bell is his undoing." Holmes nodded to himself. "It is a clock that does not tell time, me tells truth." Before I could ask what he meant, he snapped the lid shut and pocketed the watch. "You will say nothing of this, Watson, not yet. Not even to Rendell. Especially not to Rendell. Why?" He paused, studying me for a moment. "'Cause I do not yet know if the clue condemns the guilty or absolves the wronged." The following morning, we returned to Fleet Lane. Josiah Rendell met us at the rear entrance to the shop, his face haggard from another sleepless night. He ushered us quickly through the storeroom, pausing only to check the locks twice. "I kept everything sealed, as you instructed," he said. "But there were sounds last night, okay? Like footsteps on the stairs. No one was there when I checked." Holmes gave a noncommittal hum and began his inspection of the shop, moving with the deliberate curiosity of a man counting ghosts. He ignored the front room and instead moved through the workroom, past the benches, toward a small storage alcove I had barely noticed before. It was a cramped, cobwebbed space half past shelves stacked with unused clock parts and dusty ledgers. Holmes paused at the far wall, where a tall case clock leaned, broken and unrestored, against the bricks. He tapped the back panel. "Help me with this, Watson." Together, we shifted the clock aside. Behind it, obscured from casual view, was a narrow wooden access door set low into the wall. It had no knob, just a tiny keyhole ringed with rust. Holmes turned to Rendell. "Have you ever seen this?" Rendell blinked. "Not in years. It leads to the subcellar. My father boarded it up after an apprentice took a fall in the 50s. Claimed it wasn't safe. Yet the panel is clean around the edges," Holmes said. "Someone has accessed it recently." Rendell paled. Holmes knelt and examined the keyhole, scratched. Brass filings. "Someone has a key or something that serves as one." He rose. "I will return tonight alone." Rendell looked uneasy. "Is that wise?" "No," Holmes said, "but it is necessary." That evening, Holmes left with little more than a lantern, his revolver, and the serpent watch. I begged him to allow me to accompany him, but he refused with finality. "What I suspect is true, Watson. Your presence would be a danger not just to yourself, but to the case. I need you to remain here in case something happens." I did not sleep that night. It was past midnight when I heard footsteps on the stairs repeat. Then the door burst open and Holmes stepped in, covered in dust, a smear of blood on his collar. I leaped up. "My God, Holmes." "I am fine," he said, brushing past me. "But we are no longer dealing with speculation. We are dealing with confession." He flung something onto the table, a pocket diary, bound in cracked black leather. I opened it. The pages were brittle, scrawled in a spidery hand. He took it all. The shop, the tools, the trade, canned father's name. Now his sons shall lose what he stole. Another entry. 3 sons, 1 for each tick. The watch will teach him what it means to wait. Elias Rendell, Holmes said. He's been living in the subcellar underground beneath the shop. There is a cot, a kettle, a bench and parts, clock parts, sharpened, arranged into shapes. I stared at him in horror. He's been there the entire time, watching, Holmes said, watching, judging. But why leave the watch for Josiah to find? Because that was the performance. Clockmaker must become the victim of his own lie. Caius wanted Josiah to feel it, feel the fear, the helplessness, the erosion of legacy. Caius, Holmes, held up the watch, but he made one mistake. He left a message behind burned into the brass. It contradicts the story. It hints at manipulation, not justice. And you confronted him? I did. Where is he now? Gone. He fled before I arrived, left the diary and a mechanical rig designed to open the serpent watch at the stroke of midnight and release a chemical vapor. I stared at him. A poison, a suggestion of one, enough to drop blood pressure, induce panic. It's why Samuel collapsed, why Arthur's heart stopped. It's not supernatural, but psychosomatic, driven by fear. Holmes looked into the fire, voice low. It was never about killing. It was about undoing. Okay? And Josiah Rendell's guilt trio. Or not was the tool. He turned to me. Oh, we must set the final trap. The liar will return for his final tick. Sherlock Holmes and the Clockmaker's curse. False trails and suspense. The silence between the ticks, narrated by Dr. John H. Watson. for the next 48 hours. Holmes worked in deliberate confusion and he dragged me along for every step of it. He gave conflicting instructions to the yard, sent false messages to Rendell, and left misleading notes in public places he knew would be intercepted. He made certain that the story spreading through Fleet Lane was not one of Elias. Rendell, the vengeful heir-butt of a far more mundane explanation, sabotage by a disgruntled competitor named Merrick Tilshaw. Tilshaw was a known name in the horological circles, an eccentric shopkeeper in Soho, once passed over for a joint royal commission that Rendell's firm had secured nearly a decade ago. The man had since gained a reputation for petty grievances, obsessive patents, and a flair for writing letters to the Times that no one read. Why Tilshaw? I asked Holmes late one evening, as he methodically brushed soot onto his collar and prepared to visit the Fleet Lane alleyways in disguise. Because, Watson, the more ridiculous the theory, the more likely our true culprit will let down his guard, Holmes said. Tilshaw is a red herring fattened for slaughter. He serves a dual purpose. He distracts the police and gives Elias Rendell the illusion that we are blind. But Elias is gone, I said. You said he fled. He fled the cellar. Yes, Holmes murmured, but not the city. Mark my words, he's still here, watching, listening, and, if I know anything of theatrical minds, he won't allow his final act to be misinterpreted. He'll return to correct it. He paused, adjusting the brim of his hat, lest we make him believe it has already succeeded. The next morning, Inspector Gregson arrived at Baker Street, face flushed and coat damp with fog. T had heard the Tilshaw theory. Holmes had made sure of it, and he was, predictably, skeptical. Sabotage, jealousy. Come now, Holmes, he said, removing his gloves with practiced irritation. You're telling me this entire affair, this whole cursed timepiece business, was just a work of a bitter clockmaker? Holmes leaned back in his chair and sighed. Of course not, Gregson. I'm simply saying that's what you should write in your official report. Gregson blinked. What? I need you to make noise, Inspector, Holmes said. Hold. Tilshaw, overnight. Leak it to the press. Let the news reach Fleet Lane by this evening. Make our adversary comfortable. Gregson's eyes narrowed. This is another one of your damn psychological gambits, isn't it? It's only because the psychological is precisely where our enemy has struck. Let the criminal think we've misfired. Only then will he walk back into our sights. Gregson muttered something unkind under his breath, but ultimately agreed. He knew Holmes's instincts too well to argue for long. That night, Holmes and I returned to Rendell's shop alone. Josiah met us at the door, visibly worn and thinner than when we'd first met. He said little, and Holmes offered even less. The three of us moved like shadows through the showroom and into the workroom, where the serpent watch had been placed beneath a glass dome on the main bench. Holmes examined the object with quiet precision. Then he turned to Rendell. You are still receiving anonymous notes, are you not? Rendell hesitated, then reached into his coat and produced a small envelope. Inside was a single strip of parchment, no larger than a postage stamp. It read, "At the final chime, your line ends." Holmes read it, nodded, and returned it to its envelope. It's nearly time. It's nearly time. For what? I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. For Elias to come and see what his creation has done. We fed him just enough noise leaks about Tilshaw, gossip from the yard, planted conversations. He will come, Watson. He must. Holmes turned to Rendell. You will remain upstairs. Lock your door. God, do not come down, no matter what you hear. Rendell nodded, pale as wax. We waited. The minutes passed slowly. Outside, London seemed to hold its breath. Even the gaslights burned a little lower. Holmes sat with his back to the far wall, revolver on his lap, eyes fixed on the shop's entrance. I sat near the stairs, listening to the tick of the great clocks that lined the showroom, each one beating its own mechanical rhythm and orchestra of unease. It was precisely 11:42 when the bell above the shop door chimed. Timed. No one had opened. Holmes tensed, but did not rise. Then movement. A whisper of motion near the rear hallway. A shadow passed across the doorway leading to the cellar. A scrape of metal on stone. Holmes stood, silently, revolver at his side. Then the voice came. You were not supposed to understand. Was soft, fragile, like parchment crumbling in one's hand. I designed it to be felt, not solved. Holmes stepped into the hall, keeping to the edge of the wall. I followed at a crouch, heart pounding. Elias Rendell stood at the threshold of the sub-cellar, lantern in hand. He looked even thinner than Holmes had described, like a man built of wires and regret. His beard was matted, his eyes hollow. The watch was truth, he said. I only gave it form. Holmes didn't raise the revolver. No, Mr. Rendell. The watch was a mirror, and like most mirrors, it showed what the viewer was already prepared to see. Elias blinked, confused. You left symbols, Holmes said. Snicks, scythes, hourglasses. But what killed Arthur and Samuel was not your machine, it was your father's legacy. The pressure, the expectation. The shame Josiah never spoke aloud. You merely gave it a language. Elias stepped forward, hand trembling. They were hollow, inheritors of nothing. He took everything from my father. And in trying to reclaim it, Holmes said, you became what you despised, a man shaping lives by force. For a moment, Elias looked as if he might collapse. Then, with one sudden, desperate motion, he pulled a small vial from his coat and raised it to his lips. Holmes moved with terrifying speed. He struck the vial from Elias's hand and caught it in mid-air before it could shatter on the floor. It's not yet midnight, Holmes said, voice cold. You don't get to choose the ending. Inspector Gregson arrived 5 minutes later. Elias was taken quietly, without resistance. Later, after the shop was sealed and the clocks silenced, Holmes and I stood alone in the misty street. He would have killed himself, I said, if you hadn't stopped him. He already had, Holmes said, just slowly, tick by tick. He held up the serpent watch. I will see to it this never ticks again. Sherlock Holmes and the Clockmaker's Curse. Chapter 4, *, False Trails and Suspense Between the Hours. Narrated by Dr. John H. Watson. The days that followed were thick with unease. London moved on, indifferent as always, but within the narrowing circle of our investigation, time no longer felt sequential. It stuttered. It paused in corners, doubled back on itself like a poorly cut gear. The serpent watch sat enclosed in a light-lined box atop Holmes's desk, till ticking. Faint and insistent, like a second heartbeat in the room, but there were no further attacks, no letters, no signs of Elias Rendell, no movement from the sub-cellar, which Inspector Gregson's man had now sealed under Holmes's instructions. To all appearances, the investigation had reached its limit. Rendell remained in hiding. The trail had grown cold, and Holmes, of all people, seemed to stall, or so I thought. What we appear to be doing, Holmes said one morning as he stirred his tea absent-mindedly, is precisely what we must do. We had not left Baker Street in 2 days. The constables had been dismissed. Josiah Rendell was under instructions to speak to no one and maintain the appearance of calm. I spent the hours rereading our notes, tracing timelines, questioning our assumptions, but Holmes simply watched the fire, read obscure volumes on symbolic geometry, and compose strange staccato violin melodies that never resolved into harmony. You mean to say, I replied, that this, nothing, is part of your plan? I am not pursuing, he said flatly. I am inviting. You think Elias is still in London? I think he has never left. Holmes rose and moved to the window. Fog rolled through Baker Street like smoke, blurring the faces of passers-by into indistinct phantoms. He watched in silence, hands clasped behind his back. He's watching, Holmes said, listening. The Serpent Watch was only the first act. The real theater is what comes after. And we're meant to play the fools. No, he said, we're meant to play the audience. Let him think his performance has worked. Let him grow careless in success. He paused. But it's a delicate balance. If we appear too resigned, we look suspicious. If we push too hard, he hides. So we give him space, just enough. He turned to me with a curious gleam. That is why you, Watson, are going to interview the wrong suspect. The next day, under Holmes's instruction, I paid a visit to one Merrick Tilshawk Clockmaker, patent hoarder, and, according to Holmes's orchestration, the new suspect in what he'd allowed the newspapers to call the clock shop curse. Tilshaw was a narrow, pallid man whose fingers twitched constantly, as if perpetually winding something invisible. His shop in Soho reeked of turpentine and regret, though he had no connection to the Rendels beyond professional jealousy. Holmes's careful leaks had turned rumor into smoke, and smoke into attention. You think I did this? Tilshaw exclaimed as I stood in his cluttered storefront. That I cursed a watch to murder a family. Outrageous. The only thing I ever killed was a coiled mainspring in '87. I'm simply following all possible leads, I said diplomatically, eyes scanning the shelves. Every surface was stacked with ticking mechanisms, none of them in sync. Everyone always blames the eccentric, Tilshaw grumbled, folding his arms. Because I refused to simplify the anchor escapement for the masses. Because I once shouted at Rendell at a trade conference. That makes me a killer. Do you deny having designs similar to the Serpent Watch? I asked. He flinched. That thing? Obscene. Whoever made it should have their tools confiscated. It's not even a true watch, it's performance art. Offends the dignity of timekeeping. That reaction, Holmes would later say, was exactly what he had anticipated. By the time I returned to Baker Street, I found Holmes standing over a half-enrolled city map, marking points in red. Tilshaw's outrage was genuine, I reported. Excellent, Holmes said. Elias will have heard of it by now, and you're certain he cares what we believe. Oh, he cares deeply, Holmes murmured. That's what makes this so delicate. Elias Rendell is not simply exacting revenge, he's curating it. He wants to be understood, Watson, or at least misremembered correctly. Holmes stepped back from the map and gestured to a triangular pattern drawn between Fleet Lane, Poplar Cemetery, the East End. I believe Elias is hiding somewhere within this triangle, Holmes said. We won't find him by looking. We will draw him out. He turned to me. I'm going to publish an open letter, an editorial, under my own name, K, dismissing the curse as superstition and suggesting Josiah Rendell fabricated the story to attract sympathy. I stared at him. You're going to insult a grieving father publicly. I'm going to insult Ilias's myth, Holmes corrected, and when he cannot abide that distortion, when he feels compelled to intervene, then we'll have him. The letter appeared in the Evening Gazette 2 days later. It's The Machinery of Delusion, a logical view of the Fleet Lane affair by Mr. Sherlock Holmes. It was written with Holmes's characteristic dryness, deriding occult interpretations, criticizing the Metropolitan Police for chasing phantoms, and accusing Josiah Rendell of theatrical grief, amplified by inherited guilt and professional decline. The reaction was immediate. Letters to the editor poured in. Some praised Holmes's reasoned skepticism. Others decried his insensitivity. One anonymous letter arrived at Baker Street, directly handwritten in crimson ink on parchment. You think guilt can be measured with scales and ruled lines, but guilt Mr. Holmes breathes, and when it exhales, it kills. There was no signature. Holmes read it, smiled faintly, and folded it into his coat pocket. "We have him," he said. "Okay." That night, Holmes requested I remain awake and ready, but said little else. At midnight, he donned his coat, placed the serpent watch inside its lined box once more, and left without telling me where he was going. I waited until nearly dawn. No word, no return. The fire burned low. The city outside felt suspended in frost and tension. The silence had weight. When the bell above our door finally rang, I leaped from the chair. Holmes entered, eyes sharp, despite the fatigue behind them. His coat was damp, his boots muddied. He placed something on the table. A small brass object, half polished, shaped like an eye. From his hideout, he said. It's an ornament he used to watch the Rendell shop from a rooftop shed 2 streets over. Elias Rendell was there. He read the letter. He saw the headlines, and he moved again. Did you confront him? I did not need to. He's reacting. He's angry. That's the beginning of a mistake. Holmes said. We have pulled the thread. Now we wait to see what unravels. Sherlock Holmes and the Clockmaker's curse. The Trap. The final winding, narrated by Dr. John H. Watson. The city's usual restless murmur had faded into a tense hush as we approached the final act of this dreadful play. Holmes was quieter than I had seen him in weeks, his countenance grave, his hands steady as he assembled his instruments. A revolver, a small lantern, and the serpent watch itself still ticking faintly inside its blind box. This is the hour, Watson, he said. Clock strikes 12, and with it, Elias Rendell will make his move. We had spent days weaving our web of misdirection. The letter in the Evening Gazette had ruffled the feathers of our quarry, drawing him out from the shadows of the East End. Holmes' staged investigation of Merrick Tilshaw had distracted the authorities, but we laid in wait at Rendell & Sons, ready to spring the final trap. Josiah Rendell was safely upstairs, under the watchful care of Constable Lestrade, who had been briefed extensively. The shop's heavy wooden door was barred, windows shuttered. But the heart of the trap was inside the serpent watch itself. Holmes explained the design of his plan as we settled into the cramped back room. Elias believes the watch is the mechanism of his revenge, the harbinger of doom for Josiah's family. We shall give him one last performance, final act, where he controls the stage, but not the outcome. I leaned forward, intrigued. How? Do you intend to lure him in? Holmes smiled thinly. By ensuring he believes his masterpiece is about to be revealed. We will allow the watch to unwind completely, and he will be here to witness it. He gestured to the clockworks on the workbench. This watch is a complex ruse. There is a hidden compartment designed to release a gas at midnight, a narcotic meant to incapacitate. Callias expects it to function as planned. We shall neutralize that element, replace it with harmless vapor, and wait. The shop will be bait. Then, I said, exactly, cannot resist the temptation to witness the fruition of his design. As midnight approached, Holmes and I concealed ourselves in a small adjoining room with a vantage point over the main workshop. The serpent watch rested beneath a glass dome on the workbench, illuminated by a low lantern. The ticking grew louder, more insistent. At precisely 11:57 p.m., a faint sound echoed from the street as slow footfall approaching Fleet Lane's crooked entrance. Holmes's gaze sharpened. There, he whispered. A figure emerged from the fog, a gaunt, ragged man cloaked in shadow. Elias Rendell moved cautiously, clutching a small lantern, eyes wild but calculating. He paused at the threshold, taking in the scene, the sealed door, the silent clocks. Then, with the steadiness that belied his exhaustion, he stepped inside. Holmes raised his revolver, but did not move. Elias's voice was low, laced with bitter irony. So, you have invited me to watch the final hour, a performance worthy of my father's legacy. He moved to the workbench, eyes locked on the serpent watch. Do you understand what this watch means? He said. It does not count time, it counts regret. Each tick is a lifetime lost. Each chime a soul extinguished. Holmes's voice was calm but unyielding. It is a symbol, Mr. Rendell, a mirror held to a man's own conscience. Elias laughed a sound that was more a rasp than mirth. Conscience. I killed no man. I only made sure the shadow of his theft stretched long enough to cover the next generation. Holmes stepped forward, leveling the revolver. Your theatrics are noted, but it ends here. For a moment, Elias did not respond. Then he slowly reached inside his coat and produced a small vial. Do you still think me a monster? He lifted the vial. Here is the truth you seek. Holmes's eyes flickered. With lightning reflexes, he struck the vial from Elias's hand, catching it before it shattered. The vial contained a faintly iridescent liquid. Not tonight, Holmes said. Elias's shoulders sagged. He looked at Holmes, no longer angry, but exhausted. You have undone the final movement, he whispered. Okay, I have lost the melody. Inspector Gregson and a team of officers arrived shortly after. Elias Rendell was taken into custody, quietly, without resistance. Later, as the shop was secured and the clocks silenced, Holmes and I stood alone outside, the fog curling around us like a veil. You stopped him from ending his life, I said. Was that mercy or necessity? Holmes's gaze was distant. He had already begun to unravel himself. His vengeance was self-destructive, a slow collapse. By intervening, I have delayed the inevitable. He held up the serpent watch, now silent beneath the glass. Huh? This watch will tick no more. He turned and began walking away. But the true curse, Holmes said over his shoulder, is not the mechanical contrivance. It is the burden we bear of time and the choices that echo through it. Sherlock Holmes and the Clockmaker's curse, the confession, or catch the Clockmakers. Truth Unveiled, narrated by Dr. John H. Watson. The next morning dawned bleak and gray. Much like the city itself, seemed to sigh with exhaustion after the previous night's revelations. Inside the warm confines of our Baker Street sitting room, air was thick with the anticipation that accompanies the moment of unveiling the final turning of a long-wound key. Holmes stood by the window, eyes flickering with that peculiar light I had come to associate with the satisfaction of having disentangled a knot that no one else could approach. He turned to me and said quietly, Watson, it is time. I settled into my chair, ready to listen, but also prepared for the emotional weight that such moments invariably carry. Holmes began slowly, choosing each word with deliberate care. From the outset, this case has been a puzzle of legacy and illusion, one in which the gears of vengeance, guilt, and familial obligation have meshed in complex ways. The serpent watch, the curses whispered in shadows, and the unexplained collapses of Josiah Rendell's sons were symptoms, not the disease. He paced the room, fingers steepled. Let us start with Elias Rendell, the man who, despite appearances, was never meant to be merely the villain of this story. Elias was a product of two forces, a father's prideful injustice and a brother's silence. His father, Francis Rendell, was cast aside and disinherited, a wound passed down like a secret heirloom. Holmes gestured to the watch, resting in its case on the mantelpiece. This watch, this grotesque clockwork, Serpentis's signature, not a murder weapon, but a psychological device. It was engineered to induce terror, to unravel Josiah Rendell's grasp on reality by forcing him to confront the intangible weight of guilt. Holmes's eyes brightened with intensity. Arthur and Samuel, Josiah's eldest sons, succumbed not to poison or blade, but to the psychosomatic terror that Elias's contraption was designed to evoke. The watch's slowed, uneven ticking created a dissonance that preyed on their nerves and hearts. Samuel's fainting and Arthur's fatal collapse were tragic consequences of this design. He folded his hands behind his back. But Elias's intent was never to kill outright. He wished to make Josiah suffer, to watch him lose his sons one by one as the metaphorical hourglass emptied. Holmes walked to the window, drawing back the curtain slightly to reveal the London streets. The symbolic motifs, the serpent, the scythe, the hourglass are all elements Elias used to craft a narrative of retribution. He wanted Josiah to feel the consequences of his father's presumed betrayal. I ventured, cautiously, "And Josiah, what of his part in this family drama? Was he innocent?" Holmes nodded slowly. "Innocent? Hardly. But no man is purely villain or saint. Josiah was burdened with the weight of his family's fractured past. A man who sought to build a legacy, yet was haunted by the silence around his brother's fate." Holmes's voice softened. His failure was in not addressing that past. He buried it beneath clockwork and tradition, hoping the mechanics of time would smooth over the fractures. He did not know Elias was plotting beneath his very feet. I looked toward the serpent watch again and asked, "How did you uncover all this?" Holmes smiled faintly. Every clue pointed to a story longer than the days we observed. The hidden door behind the grandfather clock, the scratched keyhole, Elias's diary, all were breadcrumbs. But the pivotal moment came when I found the scorched inscription inside the watch. It spoke of a lyre and a bell, indicating a deliberate deception tied to time itself. He glanced at me. The final revelation was that Elias never intended the watch to simply tell time. It was meant to tell the truth about a family fractured by secrets and perceived betrayals. Holmes's expression darkened. But the story is not merely psychological. It is a tragedy of missed opportunities and unspoken grievances. Elias's plan was cruel, but rooted in a yearning for recognition, perhaps even reconciliation through reckoning. He walked back to the desk and picked up the diary. His writings reveal a man tormented by his family's history, consumed by a need to make Josiah acknowledge the wounds inflicted by their father's death and inheritance. This was his way of making time stand still until justice, in his eyes, was served. I asked quietly, "And what of Edward, the youngest son?" "He fled London." Holmes folded the diary with care. Edward escaped the pattern, but not the pain. Fear drove him away. Elisa's design was a clockwork countdown, one son lost with each tick. Edward was the last piece on Elias's chessboard, the final pawn to fall. Holmes's eyes held a trace of pity. "But with Elias now in custody, that clock has stopped. Edward may yet find peace." Holmes looked up, his gaze steady. "This case reminds us, Watson, that time is both a healer and a tormentor. The mechanics of a clock are cold and precise, but the human heart beats to a far more complicated rhythm. Elias Randell's curse was not a supernatural malediction, but a constructed echo of family anguish." He placed the watch gently back into its lined box. In the end, it was not the watch that it was the past, unaddressed and festering. As the morning light spilled across Baker Street, I reflected on Holmes's words. My case had been one of mechanical mystery, yes, but beneath that, a deep human tragedy. A family fractured by pride, silence, and the relentless ticking of time. Holmes sat back, lighting his pipe. "There are no winners in such stories," he said quietly. "Only those who survive the telling." Chapter 5. Aftermath. The Hourglass of Mercy, narrated by Dr. John H. Watson. The weeks following Elias Randell's arrest passed in a somber haze. The public's fascination with the so-called Clockmaker's curse gradually faded as the sensational headlines gave way to the slow churn of everyday London life. Yet, Beneath the surface, the repercussions lingered like the faint echo of a bell long silenced. I visited Josiah Rendell on a damp morning, just as the city struggled to shake free from a lingering drizzle. The Clockmaker shop on Fleet Lane remained shuttered, a forlorn presence amid the bustle of neighboring businesses. Josiah greeted me with the weary dignity of a man who had endured more than most could bear and was only beginning to reckon with the void left behind. He was thinner than when I first met him, his face etched with lines deeper than time itself. Eyes, once sharp and resolute, now held a quiet vulnerability, tempered by sorrow and the slow acceptance of loss. "Dr. Watson," he said, voice hollow yet steady, "thank you for coming. Holmes as well, I trust." "Holmes is at the flat," I replied gently, "but he sends his regards and his thoughts." Josiah gestured to the bench where once the serpent watch had sat. "It is strange, isn't it? How something so small can unravel an entire world." I nodded. "Holmes said it was never the watch that killed. It was the past." Josiah sighed. "My family has been bound by time and tradition for generations. But the true curse was the silence between my father and my uncle, between myself and my sons. We never spoke of the fractures, only of keeping the clocks running." He paused, fingers twitching restlessly. "When Arthur died, I was numb. But when Samuel collapsed, I realized the damage ran deeper than any clockwork. Yet I was powerless. It was like watching a slow-motion tragedy, unable to intervene." I asked, "And Edward?" Josiah's gaze darkened. He fled, afraid of the past catching him like a shadow. "I cannot blame him." Key looked out the window, watching the street beyond with a distant air. The community's reaction to the ordeal was mixed. Fleet Lane's residents were kind, yet a palpable discomfort lingered. Rumors whispered in hushed tones about curses and family secrets. The Rendell story became a cautionary tale about pride, vengeance, and the invisible threads that bind and unravel families. At the church service, held in memory of Arthur Rendell Holmes, and I stood among a congregation heavy with grief and reflection. The vicar spoke of forgiveness and reconciliation, urging those gathered to seek peace beyond the broken clocks of bitterness. After the service, several neighbors approached Josiah, offering condolences and quiet support. It was clear that, despite the shadows cast by Elias's actions, there remained a deep respect for a man who had borne his losses with dignity. Back at Baker Street, Holmes remained contemplative. He had never been one to dwell on sentiment, yet even he seemed affected by the case's human cost. "Watson," he said one evening, "this affair has reminded me of the fragile balance between logic and compassion. We saw puzzles to bring order to chaos, but the pieces themselves are often shards of human suffering." I agreed. "It is the weight of those shards that makes the work so difficult." Holmes nodded. "Precisely. And while justice demands clarity, mercy requires understanding." He looked out the window toward the gaslit street. "Josiah Rendell is a man who has lost much, but perhaps in loss finds a chance to rebuild, not with gears and springs, but with honesty and openness." The curse was not mechanical. It was emotional. In the days that followed, Josiah began the slow process of repairing his family's legacy. He reopened the shop, albeit cautiously, and took on apprentices, determined to pass on not just the skill of horology, but the lessons of trust and communication that had eluded his own family. Edward Rendell, having returned quietly from his exile, sought reconciliation with his father. Though the wounds were raw, there was a shared understanding, a mutual desire to heal what had long been broken. Holmes and I observed these developments with quiet satisfaction. The case, though resolved in terms of law and detection, had opened deeper questions about time, memory, and forgiveness. One afternoon, as I recorded these reflections, Holmes played his violin softly in the corner. The melody was wistful, full of unresolved notes and lingering pause, much like the story of the Rendles themselves. He glanced at me, a faint smile playing on his lips. Every mystery has its final note, Watson. Sometimes it is triumphant, times it is a quiet lament, but all are necessary in the great symphony of human experience. I smiled in return, feeling the truth of his words. And, in the end, I said, we are all bound by the same ticking clock. Closing reflection, the final tick, narrated by Dr. John H. Watson. The days after Josiah Rendle's tentative return to normalcy passed without incident. The streets of Fleet Lane gradually shedding the shroud of suspicion and unease that had once clung so tightly. Yet, as with all such tales, there lingered a quiet aftertaste, subtle reminder that the machinery of human nature is rarely as precise or predictable as any clock. One evening, as the last gas lamps sputtered to life, along Baker Street, Holmes and I sat by the fire in our familiar sitting room. The Serpent Watch, now utterly silent and locked away, had become little more than a symbol reminder of the thin line that separates order from chaos, reason from fear. Holmes leaned back in his chair, fingers interlaced behind his head, eyes fixed on the flickering flames. "You asked me once, Watson," he began softly, "whether time is a friend or a foe. Tonight, I think I can offer you an answer." I settled deeper into my chair, prepared for one of his rare contemplations. "Time," he continued, "is neither benevolent nor malevolent. It is a relentless force, impartial, indifferent, and utterly constant, like a master clockmaker who neither favors nor condemns the hands that move within his creation." He gestured toward the silent watch on the mantelpiece. The Rendle family's tragedy was not born of time itself, but of their inability to confront the moments that time exposes secrets, regrets, silences. Holmes paused, exhaling a thin plume of smoke from his pipe. The curse was not mechanical, Tidge, it was moral, and therein lies the paradox. I mused aloud. So, the curse was their own past catching up with them. Holmes nodded slowly. "Precisely. The past is a shadow, ever lengthening, and we often mistake it for something beyond our control. Yet it is shaped by our choices, what we hide, what we reveal, and what we fail to say." He looked at me then, a rare softness in his eyes. "Watson, it is our duty not only to solve the mysteries of the external world, but also to acknowledge the mysteries within ourselves. The greatest puzzles are not always those of murder or deceit, but those of the heart and conscience." I reflected on the Rendle's ordeal, the quiet, terrible unraveling of a family bound by pride and silence. "Is justice then simply understanding?" I asked. Holmes smiled faintly. "Justice is a balance, Watson, a careful calibration between law and mercy, logic and empathy. Sometimes it requires seeing beyond the clockwork into the spaces between the ticks." He stood and approached the window, drawing aside the curtain to gaze out at the fog-laden street. London is a city of countless stories, each one ticking in its own rhythm. Some end with applause, others with silence, but all are part of the great mechanism. Holmes turned back to me with the final remark, delivered in his customary dry tone. "As for the Serpent Watch," he said, "I shall recommend it be kept locked away, not as a curiosity, but as a reminder." "A reminder of what?" I asked. He tapped the case lightly. That even the most precise instruments cannot measure the weight of human guilt, and that some curses are only broken when we learn to forgive, not just others, but ourselves. I nodded in understanding. As the fire dwindled to embers and the city outside settled into its restless night, I felt once more the delicate balance Holmes had so deftly maintained throughout our investigation, the balance between reason and compassion, past and present, the clockmaker and his curse, Chapter 6, Epilogue, Echoes Beyond the Hour, narrated by Dr. John H. Watson. Several months had passed since the serpent watch ceased its relentless ticking, and with its silence, a fragile peace had settled over Fleet Lane. The Rendell clockworks, once the heart of a family's legacy and grief, now served as a quiet reminder of wounds slowly healing beneath the surface. I found myself drawn back to the shop one gray morning, the air thick with the scent of rain and aged wood. Josiah Rendell greeted me with a tentative smile, less the man worn by tragedy, more the craftsman reclaiming his purpose. He spoke with a soft humility, sharing how the ordeal had altered his perspective. "I have come to understand," he said, "that time is not merely the passing of hours, but the unfolding of truth. The watches we make measure moments, but they cannot measure the human heart that is left to us." Josiah had begun teaching his apprentices not just the mechanics of horology, but the lessons of patience, honesty, and reconciliations, virtues he once overlooked in the pursuit of precision. Holmes, ever the enigma, seemed more contemplative during these months. His keen intellect remained as sharp as ever, but I noticed a deepening in his reflections, a subtle softness beneath his relentless pursuit of logic. One evening, as the rain drummed softly on the windows of Baker Street, Holmes shared a rare meditation. "Watson, every case, no matter how intricate, is but a fragment of a larger tapestry. The clockmaker's curse was a story of time, yes, but also of silence, regret, and the yearning to be heard." He paused, fingers tapping rhythmically on the armrest. "We solve mysteries to restore order, yet the true restoration lies in understanding. Justice without mercy is a clock missing its hands." I considered the words long after Holmes had fallen silent, reflecting on the fragile balance between the rigid mechanics of law and the fluid nature of human experience. The Rendell story lingered with me not just as a tale of mystery unraveled, but as a testament to the complexities we all carry beneath the surface. In the quiet moments at Baker Street, as Holmes returned to his violin and I to my medical practice, the serpent watch remained locked away, its secrets contained yet resonant. Its silence was not an end, but an echo reminding us that time, with all its precision, ultimately belongs to the stories we live and the moments we dare to confront. Reverberations, The Measure of Time, narrated by Dr. John H. Watson. The months following the resolution of the Rendell case gave way to a London that moved forward and easy, perhaps, but relentless as ever. Yet, for those who had walked the tightrope of the serpent watch's shadow, the reverberations persisted like faint echoes in the stillness. Josiah Rendell, though visibly diminished by his losses, had found a new sense of purpose. The clockworks reopened slowly, the old hands returning to their stations with a mixture of respect and trepidation. Apprentices listened not only to the tick of gears, but also to lessons in patience and truth, imparted gently by a man now shaped as much by his grief as by his craft. I visited the shop one afternoon and found Josiah bent over a new creation, ornate mantel clock, its face calm and unmarred by serpent coils. "This is my piece," he said softly, "a clock that measures not only hours, but forgiveness." Meanwhile, Holmes's own rhythms had changed. His violin found its voice more often, melodies punctuated by the quiet hum of thought. The teas spent, hours poring over obscure texts, not for clues, but for the wisdom hidden in history's margins. One evening, as the city's gaslights flickered to life, he confided in me. "The true mystery, Watson," he said, "is not the murder, the deception, or even the curse. It is the human condition, our ceaseless quest to reconcile past wrongs with present truth." He leaned forward, eyes sharp. The serpent watch was a mechanism, yes, but also a metaphor. It reminded us that time will reveal all life, only we have the courage to face it. I found myself contemplating Holmes's words during my rounds as a physician. The delicate balance between science and the human spirit mirrored the mysteries we had unraveled together. Just as a clock's precision could not account for the unpredictability of life, so too could medicine not fully heal the wounds unseen. One afternoon, a letter arrived at Baker Street bearing a faintly familiar seal. It was from Edward Rendell, the youngest son, recently returned from his self-imposed exile. He wrote of tentative steps toward reconciliation with his father, and of his resolve to preserve the family name, not through avoidance, but through acknowledgement. Holmes read the letter with a quiet satisfaction. Perhaps, he mused, the final piece in this mechanism is forgiveness. A slow, deliberate act, much like the winding of a clock. Seasons turned, the serpent's watch remained a silent relic, locked away from the world. But its story had woven itself into the fabric of our lives, a constant reminder that while time is measured in seconds and minutes, it is lived in moments of courage, remorse, and grace. Chapter 7, The Last Movement. Time's Quiet Reckoning, narrated by Dr. John H. Watson. The city had settled into its usual rhythm, a fog weaving through the streets like an old ghost determined to linger, indifferent to the passing of days and tragedies. Yet, beneath that familiar cloak, subtle transformations unfolded. At Baker Street, Holmes's focus had shifted, though his mind remained as sharp as ever. The Rendell affair had left its mark both on the family and on my friend, who seemed less inclined toward his customary detachment and more open to pondering the complexities of human frailty. One afternoon, as I returned from the infirmary, I found Holmes seated before the fireplace, his violin resting quietly on his lap. He looked up, meeting my gaze with a mixture of weariness and resolve. "Hassan," he said, "there are mysteries that evade our instruments and calculations. They reside in the spaces between moments, sin, silence, and remorse, and hope." I sat beside him, drawn by the rare candor. Josiah Rendell's journey, Holmes continued, has been one from denial through despair to cautious acceptance. His decision to reopen the shop signals a desire to reclaim time lost, to wind anew the fragile springs of life. The clockworks themselves bore witness to this rebirth. The apprentices, under Josiah's watchful eye, moved with a reverence that spoke of more than mere craftsmanship. They seemed to understand that they were tending to a legacy both mechanical and moral. One such apprentice, a bright-eyed youth named Samuel Clark, shared with me his admiration for Josiah's renewed spirit. "Mr. Rendell teaches us that every tick carries meaning," Samuel said. "Not just the passage of ours, but the moments we choose to make right." Meanwhile, Edward Rendell had fully returned to the fold, determined to honor his family's name with integrity and openness. His letters to Josiah, once hesitant, grew frequent and heartfelt, bridging the chasms wrought by fear and silence. Holmes, ever perceptive, remarked one evening that Edward's return was as much a restoration of time's flow as any clock's mechanism. Yet, it was not only the Rendells who were changed. Our work, our understanding of time's dual nature, both measured and felt, began to influence my own reflections as a physician. I observed patients whose ailments were as much born of the past's unresolved grief as of physical maladies, and I came to appreciate the need for healing beyond the body in the mind and spirit. One rainy evening, Holmes confided in me his own contemplation on the nature of time and justice. "The serpent watch," he said, "was a cruel reminder that while clocks measure seconds, human hearts measure consequence." He looked toward the window, rain streaking the glass like tears. In this city of ceaseless movement, it is easy to lose sight of the moments that truly mattered, the apologies unsaid, the forgiveness withheld, the truths buried beneath pride. He turned back to me, voice low but clear. "Perhaps the greatest detective work is not in unmasking villains, but in unveiling the courage to face ourselves." As the months turned into a new season, the serpent watch remained silent, a relic, locked away but never forgotten. Its tale had become part of the fabric of our lives, a timeless echo, reminding us that while we cannot halt time's passage, we can shape the way we live within its span. The Gentle Turn, Forging Time Anew. Narrated by Dr. John H. Watson. The crisp chill of early autumn had settled upon London, painting the streets with shades of amber and gold. The city's pulse was steady, unhurried, as if time itself had paused to catch its breath. Yet, within the quiet, life's subtle movements bore witness to renewal. Fleet Lane's clockworks, once a chamber of shadows and whispered fears, had become a beacon of resilience. Josiah Rendell's steady hands guided the apprentices through the intricate dance of gears and springs, each movement deliberate, filled with renewed purpose. One afternoon, as I entered the shop, Josiah was at his bench, carefully assembling a delicate mechanism. The shop smelled of polished brass and oiled wood, a fragrance redolent of tradition and hope. He looked up and smiled a smile, not of triumph, but of quiet resolve. "Dr. Watson," he greeted warmly, "time, I have come to believe, is not merely a measure of what passes, but a promise of what can be made anew." His eyes, though lined with experience and sorrow, sparkled with an ember of optimism. Edward Rendell's presence was felt throughout the shop. His return had rekindled not just a fractured family, but a legacy built on openness and shared responsibility. I observed their interactions, father and son, working side by side, their dialogue no longer marked by unspoken tension, but by mutual respect. Edward confided in me during a brief respite, sharing his vision for the clockwork's future. "We are not just repairing clocks," he said. "We are repairing time itself, repairing the moments lost to fear and silence." At Baker Street, Holmes seemed touched by the unfolding renewal, his characteristic intensity softened by a deeper reflection. One evening, as rain tapped gently on the windows, he spoke of the case in a tone more philosophical than forensic. The Rendell family's ordeal was a study in time's paradox, how the past shapes the present, and how our perception of time can imprison or liberate us. He paused, staring into the fire's flickering light. "We solve crimes to restore order, but sometimes the greatest order is found in embracing the disorder of human emotion." I found myself pondering the resonance of Holmes's words during my medical rounds. Patients whose maladies intertwined with grief and regret underscored the intricate relationship between mind and body, past and present. The lessons of the Serpent Watch had seeped beyond the realm of mystery into the very fabric of healing. One quiet afternoon, Josiah presented me with a gift-on, exquisitely crafted pocket watch. Simple in design, but flawless in function. "It is a token," he said, "of time's gentler turner, reminder that while the past cannot be undone, the future can be shaped by our choices." Holmes examined the watch with approving eyes. "An apt symbol," he remarked, "of wisdom, tempered by experience." As autumn deepened, the Serpent Watch remained secure, its silence profound. Yet its legacy endured, a testament to time's dual nature, both unforgiving and forgiving. In the end, the case was not merely a mystery solved, but a narrative of redemption, resilience, and the enduring human capacity to forge anew from the broken hands of time. Chapter 8. The Last Tick, Closing the Circle, narrated by Dr. John H. Watson. As winter's chill crept quietly over London, the city's rhythms continued unabated, footsteps echoing on cobblestones, gas lamps flickering in the fog, the distant clang of a clock tower marking the passage of yet another hour. At 221B Baker Street, the familiar warmth of the sitting room offered refuge from the season's bite. Holmes reclined in his chair, the glow of the hearth dancing across his sharp features. I sat nearby, pen poised, ready to commit the final words of this long and intricate case. The Serpent Watch, now forever silenced within its lined box, sat untouched on the mantelpiece a relic and a reminder. Holmes began, as he so often did, with a reflection. Watson, every mystery we unravel is a small testament to the complexity of human nature. The clockmaker's curse was not a simple matter of villainy or victimhood, but a tangled weave of time, regret, and redemption. He steepled his fingers thoughtfully. Elias Rendell, in his quest for justice, became a prisoner of time's inexorable march, crafting a mechanism that was as much a psychological labyrinth as a physical contraption. His story teaches us that vengeance, when bound by silence and secrecy, becomes a trap not just for the intended, but for the avenger himself. I nodded, recalling the quiet devastation that had marked the Rendell family's journey. Josiah Rendell, I said, bore the weight of his past in solitude, yet found a way to rebuild through openness and forgiveness. It is a reminder that, while time may wound, it also heals. Holmes smiled faintly. K.D. Watson, key, and as for the watch, he gestured toward the silent device. It will remain a symbol, a monument to the human heart's intricate mechanics. The case closed, yet its lessons lingered. I often thought on the paradox that time, so precise and measured by the clocks we build, remains profoundly mysterious in how it shapes our lives and our souls. In the days that followed, Holmes returned to his violin, playing melodies both haunting and serene, perhaps echoing the unresolved harmonies of the case. One morning, I received a letter from Edward Rendell. His words spoke of reconciliation and hope of a future unburdened by the shadows of the past. Holmes read the letter with quiet satisfaction. Even time itself, he mused, must concede to the human capacity for change. As I concluded these recollections, I am reminded that every case, every story, is but a chapter in the ongoing chronicle of life's mysteries. The clock may tick steadily on, but it is the moments we choose to understand and forgive that define us. Sherlock Holmes and the Clockmaker's Curse.